is taken from Matthew chapter 22, verses 34 to 40, and it's subtitled The Greatest Commandment. Hearing that Jesus had silenced the Sadducees, the Pharisees got together. One of them, an expert in the law, tested him with this question: "Teacher, which is the greatest commandment in the law?" Jesus replied, "Love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your mind. This is the first and greatest commandment. And the second is like it. Love your neighbour as yourself. All the law and the prophets hang on these two commandments." This is the word of the Lord.
I had a quick whiz through the internet to see what I could see people were saying about neighbours. And here are some quotes that I found. "My neighbour knocked on my door this morning at 2:30 a.m. Unbelievable. Lucky I was still up playing my bagpipes." "There are many who dare not kill themselves for fear of what their neighbours will say." "I came from a real tough neighbourhood. Once a guy pulled a knife on me. I knew he wasn't a professional. The knife had butter on it." "I'd worship the ground you walked on, if only you walked in a better neighbourhood." "Love thy neighbour, and if he happens to be tall, debonair and devastating, it will be that much easier." "My neighbour asked if he could use my lawnmower, and I told him of course he could, as long as he didn't take it out of my garden." The Bible tells us to love our neighbours and also love our enemies, probably because generally they are the same people. And finally, my neighbours loved the music so much that when I turned it up, they invited the police to listen. So let's find out a bit more about neighbours from our passage. Jesus is being pestered constantly by the Sadducees and the Pharisees. And this is actually one of many questions that they have fired at him in chapter 22 of Matthew's Gospel. And what we have today is the shortest question, followed by the briefest reply, but is probably the cleverest and most significant question. Remember, these are people wanting to catch Jesus out. So far in chapter 22, in these question, debate battles, it's 2-0 to Jesus to these tricky questions. The Pharisees have already failed once, and so the Sadducees, wanting to get one up on both their religious rivals and Jesus, well, they pop up and then they ask a question about marriage and when we die. And they fail too. And so back into the ring steps the Pharisees again, and this time they are prepared with what they think is a killer punch for Jesus. But before we get to that, let's just pause for a second to remind ourselves about who these groups are. So the first group that we heard from are the Sadducees. These were rich, the elite of society, and they had a role in maintenance of the temple. Everything had to be in place and nothing could be changed, ever. Sounds a bit like the Church of England, doesn't it? The material building, the actual building itself, was important to the Sadducees. And the key beliefs that they had were free will. They didn't believe particularly in an afterlife or resurrection. They thought there weren't any rewards or any particular penalties after death. They were fairly relaxed, actually, about purity, unlike the Pharisees. So now we come to the Pharisees. The Pharisees weren't the upper class or the rich like the Sadducees. They were generally commoners who set themselves the task of being ultra-holy and ultra-righteous. Their name means one who is separate or separated. They kept many laws beyond those of the Torah, and they especially liked the laws to do with being clean and spiritually pure. They believed strongly in one God, and they were against all other gods and other gods' influences. They believed in resurrection of the dead, and they also believed strongly in the new messianic age. They were ultra-legalistic, making people do things completely out of line with what God intended. So there's two of these Jewish factions. In fact, there were three main ones. The other one were the Essenes, who are mentioned here. And all three were constantly bickering among themselves. They're fighting for political control of Judaism, both spiritually and, as I've said, politically in society as well. So you can see if one of these groups gets one over on this famous rabbi who's cropped up, Jesus, they're going to get good kudos out of that. So back to the question. It would have been a familiar question to those around. One that those three parties would have been often arguing over. What is the greatest law? This is really a classic Pharisee question, isn't it? Asked by a Pharisee lawyer. So why this question? Well, in Jewish thought, there are 613 commandments in the Torah. Some are light commandments, and some are heavy commandments. So when Jesus is asked this question, what is the greatest law? Those listening, the first thing they're wondering is, does he choose a light commandment, something easy that everyone can get along with, or something a bit more difficult? A lot of the rabbis at the time chose one particular law to particularly teach on, and lots of the rabbis made their name by picking one of these easier commandments to live by, because it's easier to get followers to follow something that's a bit easier. And there's lots, of course, slightly different takes on this question. It explains why Jesus' answer is short. He doesn't extrapolate. He doesn't give a long reason for his answer. In fact, he gives the Pharisee short shrift and moves on. Frankly, he's a bit rude to this lawyer and shows him up by not falling into the trap of saying why. So let's look at Jesus' choice. It seems obvious to us now, doesn't it? Love God and love your neighbour. Love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul and mind, and also love your neighbour as yourself. Jesus is quoting here from two different sections. The first one, Deuteronomy 6:5, and then Leviticus 19:18, and he brings those two texts together. Jesus could have chosen a more tangible commandment and been drawn into the trap of adjudicating between the arguments of the two parties who are assembled here, the Pharisees and the Sadducees. But what he chooses is love. And he makes it clear all the other laws stem from these two. You must love God, you must love others. I can imagine almost a groan from those waiting for something truly new and enlightening. Why? Because at first sight this seems like an obvious answer. A good Jew repeats Deuteronomy 6:5 twice, daily. It's called the Sema. Lots of them then and today had it written on their doorposts. What was new was that Jesus puts this law together with the law from Leviticus 19. He directly quotes scripture, offering no further explanation, but says much by doing that. On its own, the command to love your neighbour becomes the legalistic command the Pharisees make it. They turn it into the law and practical things of what is being said. And so their way of working out that law is to give so much money, so often, say so many prayers this many times. But Jesus, by putting the two together, makes the second command flow from the first. We're used to that today, aren't we? We've heard it earlier in our service. But this is not about legalities. It's about love. Actions drawn from an understanding of God. And as we know today, with Jesus' saving actions on the cross, giving us a living relationship with him. And that living relationship allows his love to flow through us and out to others. Jesus also here makes the term neighbour universal. Something he does a lot throughout his ministry. Think of the Good Samaritan, that whole parable about neighbours and about how our neighbours aren't just the ones who are close to us, but it's wider than that. The Sadducees and Pharisees saw this term strictly as relating to those you could see, those about you, family and friends, physical neighbours, those who live near you, the beggar in town. But it was strictly limited until Jesus comes in and puts these two commandments together. Jesus says, love all. And he says, the love that you show should be limitless. The legalistic Pharisees, of course, have set exact limits, the ones they think are really stringent, that only the most holy can follow. But Jesus said there are no limits. He goes beyond that and says, this love is limitless. Show your love to others. But before I finish, I want to make sure you understand that Jesus is not quoting the famous Beatles song here, all you need is love. And neither would his listeners have thought this. Instead, in answer to the question, Jesus says these two laws are the important ones because all the other laws are put in context by them. He says, Mr. Pharisee, if you would only focus on love, you might get it right. And Mr. Pharisee has no option but to concede that he is correct. So the question for us is, do we hold on to these two before all others? I wonder if some of the Jews who were listening went on to paint the second part, love your neighbour, on their doors to finish off those two that Jesus has put together. I wonder if any of them, when reciting the Sema, added Jesus' new second command that goes along with it. And if, like me, you like to think, what would Jesus do when it comes to any situation? The answer always comes in the context of these two laws. Love God and love others. Amen.